everybody. How you guys doing? Good? Good conference? Yeah. Okay, good. Wait. So yeah, I'm here today. Like I said, my name's Patrick. I work at Microsoft on Edge. You feel free to give me complaints or compliments or whatever after this. Not now. Is this on? Hello. Yeah, it's on. Sorry for the recording. Yeah, so I'm here today to talk about progressive web apps. And now, out of curiosity, who's here heard of progressive web apps before? Oh, it's beautiful. It's so much better than last year. Who here has ever built a progressive web app? Okay, cool. Not as many, but close. Okay. So yeah, like I said, I work at Edge. It's that thing. If you ever see the other logo, that's IE. That's dead, thankfully. And this is me. If you look me up on the internet, it's the avatar I pretty much use anywhere. Despite my shirt, I do work at Microsoft. That's just me holding a cake. I do one of those photos every year. My partner, Katrina, who's awesome, makes me a cake for my birthday every year. A lot of times she travels with me, but unfortunately she couldn't make it this time. She's at home taking care of her kid. It's Holden. He's a cute little baby. And it's funny, when he was born, like right before I was born, he's our first child, and I don't know if anybody here has ever had a first kid, but when you do, you get a lot of advice from people that are like, oh my God, get your sleep while you can, eat while you can, because your life's going to be completely different. Funny enough, all that was crap for us. He was the easiest baby ever. He's happy all the time. He smiles all the time. He got admitted to the hospital and they almost didn't let him because he was smiling like that. He had a 105-degree fever. He's fine now. He looks like this now. He's out of the hospital. But at the time, sorry, yeah, we live in Seattle, so everybody has to dress like this. It's either a barista or a lumberjack. He went that way. But yeah, no, he's a really chill baby. Like, no matter what we do, he's pretty much always happy all the time. He just laughs and giggles. The one thing that he doesn't like is getting in his car seat. Whenever he gets like strapped down, he's just freaks out and screams. So like all of his energy of crying gets put into that one moment. And that's fine at first because like we're tired and I'm enjoying my paternity leave or whatever. But after a few weeks and months of being in our home, kind of get cabin fever. We wanted to go out and hit the road. And so we wanted to go up to Whistler. It's a place up in Canada. It's a beautiful resort. They did the Olympics there a couple years ago. Now this is America. I live up here in Seattle. Whistler's just right up there. And this was like our first big trip outside of just going to like my parents or whatever with Holden, my son. And so I wanted to sort of be like, I don't want to be in a car with a baby in the car seat for like 3-4 hours that's freaking out the whole time. So I went online and I tried to figure out ways that could like, keep him calm. And eventually after digging around for a little while, I found this video, and it was really interesting because even though it's just really simple and dancing dots, the second I showed it to him, he just goes from either happy or sad or whatever it is to immediately just focusing on them. I don't know how it works, it just works. And if you have anybody over the age of under the age of 2 or 3, try it out because it seriously is magic. It functions. It's a little bit better frame rate than this, but gifts can only do so well. So I tried it on him and it worked, and I was like, holy shit, okay, I think I have an idea. And we get in the car and we go up, and we decide to go up to Canada and we check it out, and it was cool because it was all snowy and the winter was hanging out, and got to see the Olympic rings, and it was a lot of fun. And then we decide it's been a long day. At that point we've been up there for like 3-4 hours. It'd been like 8 hours, and excuse me. We decided to go back to home. It's gonna be about 3 hours, so we're all tired and ready to go. And I bring him into the car and I pull out my phone and it just does this. See, I have T-Mobile. It's the Deutsche Telekom, is the US version, and they offer this cool service where when you travel internationally, you get unlimited data, but that unlimited data is limited to 2G. And YouTube videos, if you don't have them saved and if you don't think ahead, which I frequently don't do, kind of sucks. And so, I was just really mad because I was like, damn it, 2G kind of completely ruined my day because my kid's freaking out in the car. He's strapped into the thing. We can't even get all the buckles on because he's like arching his back and wiggling out, and everybody who's had a kid knows probably how terrible and frustrating it's been. And Katrina's getting mad at me because I said I had a perfect solution and it's not working, and everything was just frustrating. And anyway, eventually, I was able to coerce him with a bottle and snacks and everything to eventually get in the seat. I buckled him in. And I was just kind of really irritated because he was still crying even though we got him in. Katrina was mad at me, and I was just irritated at myself because I was like, God damn it, I used 2G and I hate the internet and all this other stuff. And then as I was driving, I started thinking about it more. It wasn't so much that the slow internet speed had ruined my day as much as it was that 45 megabytes had ruined my day. The size of the video was gigantic, and that was really stupid. Like, you guys saw it, it was just a bunch of little dots. There's no reason for that to be 45 megabytes, right? It's ridiculous. It's just that it was a video, and that was the method that I was relying on. You know, I had planned for my sort of in America perfect internet on my local cell phone or my laptop. Everything worked great, but I never thought about the fact that I might someday be in low bandwidth situations. So, realizing that I was an idiot yet again, I got, like I said, we were in a car, we drove back down, I got home, and I was like, I'm gonna fix this, I'm gonna do something the correct way. It's just dots, I can make that on the internet, right? And so I opened up my text editor and just stared for like an hour because I have no idea how to make a circle in SVG. I'm pretty okay at JavaScript, but when it comes to like SVG or anything like that, I literally have no idea. I end up on W3 schools, and we all know what a bad day it is. Like, it's a really bad thing. And so after like being even more frustrated that I couldn't remember how to make a circle, I eventually was just like, screw it, I'm just gonna buy a domain, because maybe that'll give me a good idea. This is my tendency. I try and give stupid domains on every project I work at, and I came up with one for this, so it's Hush Little Baby. And eventually I got it working, right? It was cool. I figured it out. Sarah Sudayan was lucky enough to explain, like, oh, you just literally write circle and then it works. And then I wrote in a little library, got them animated, and I promised the frame rate's better if you go and check it out. And it works. It works offline. Everything's only in 6K. Has music just like the video, but that's lazy loaded in, so it doesn't block the initial render, and everything works really, really well. And I just want to go over some of the features we did to kind of make this work, and how you can make a progressive web app sort of like this. So one of the first features I did was add a service worker. Now, who here has heard of a service worker? I'm assuming, yeah, okay, great. Who here has used a service worker, like in production and stuff? Okay, cool. Everyone should raise your hand soon, because it's really not that complicated. This is basically what we did to make a service worker for this site. So we have two-step phases. We have our pre-cache phase, where we're downloading and caching all of our assets that we know for a fact is going to be used. Then we have a later caching phase, where in case I ever forget something that might be downloaded after the fact, or something that I don't necessarily want to have available offline, we have it go and download that later on. So in order to get our pre-fetch cache working, what we do is we will listen for the install event. See that little guy right there? And what we're doing is waiting for, this event is triggered when your service worker is launched the initial time. It's the very first time it's ever run, so you put code in here to do that initial pre-caching step. Then what we do is go ahead and open up the cache that we have, our pre-cache in this case, which is really just an array of files. Yeah, this array that totally rad stands for our font. It's the only asset I wanted in this demo. And all these things are promises, and so they have denables. Is anybody here not familiar with promises, out of curiosity? Awesome, it makes this much easier. And then outside of that, we have access to the cache object. Cache is one of the new APIs that's available in basically all modern browsers now. And it gives you the ability to store assets offline. Like previously, you had no clear indication whether or not an asset was available. There was the browser cache, but you didn't know, there was no way to query whether or not something was in the browser cache. The cache object is something, it's a new object within the worker context that allows you to actually check to see if something's in the cache. If it is, you can return it, you can modify it if you have access over it, or you can just ignore it and go and download something new. In this case, we're going to add all of our, we're going to iterate over our pre-fetch cache, in this case just that one domain, or that one font. And then for every single object in there, we're going to request it and then insert it into our cache so it's available offline. And then that's where that new request object comes in. And then separately, we have a fetch event. That fetch event is what's triggered if there's ever any assets that get triggered and downloaded in our worker that we didn't already prefetch. So if I say, you might notice I didn't include that music MP3. In this case, that will get caught here because it's a network event that happens after the fact. And those network events can come from anywhere. It can come from a audio or video asset, it can come from CSS, it can come from an AJAX call, anything. Yeah, just to step through it, it's the, excuse me. All we're doing is checking to see if our event is in our cache, if it do that cache.matches. If it is, we just return that response. And if it's not, we just do a new request that will go out, request it, bring it back in, and inject it into our cache. So that's how it works. And I was super stoked. I had something that worked offline, and I was all braggy about it to Katrina. And I took her over to, I brought it over to her, and I showed it to her. And she brought it up on her phone, and she got this, which was a bummer because she has an iPhone and I was using my Pixel. And the reason why is because of this. Like, service worker support is getting better, it's getting much better. It's available in all Chrome and Chromium-based browsers and Firefox. It's coming to Edge very soon, which is exciting. But in the reality, a lot of people out there have iPhones. So a lot of people don't use Chrome, believe it or not. There is a lot of other browsers that are out there. And that's kind of a bummer if you're trying to use something that works offline, and kind of really bummed me out because I had worked hard on this thing and then it immediately failed in front of Katrina. And so I started thinking, you know, what are the other possibilities on how to get something to work? And I had a really bad thought. That was AppCache. Now, has anyone here ever heard of AppCache before? Cool, you probably have because of this talk. AppCache is a douchebag. If you haven't seen this talk, you should, because it is absolutely wonderful and accurate. AppCache is a terrible API. It came out of the Google Gears project. Does anybody remember MySpace? Remember MySpace messages, how you could save them offline? It was because of Google Gears and AppCache. Yeah. It's terrible. It's terrible for a number of reasons. This talk I'll try to explain some of the reasons why, but this talk will go in, this particular one will explain why in a lot more detail than I'll go into here. I just want to keep in mind that Service Worker is way better than AppCache. In fact, AppCache is one of the only things that is actively being removed from the HTML spec. This is an email from Leonie, the person giving a talk in the other room, actually, where she thanked everybody for agreeing to remove it from the spec because it's that much of a blight on the platform. We actively want to kill it. But in the meantime, it serves our use case. And it's not only that, it's in everywhere, right? Like, look at, if IE is green, you know it's a good day. Like, it's available on a ton of platforms. And so, while Service Worker is a much stronger API and is much better, if we're just having offline assets and just having a few files, it's okay to use AppCache. It's okay to fall back to it if you understand all of the possible sharp edges. So that's what we end up doing. We will do our feature detection for Service Worker like we did before, and if the better feature is available, great. And if it's not available, we do something else. We add an AppCache, right? And in case you've never used an AppCache, anybody here ever shipped an AppCache? Okay, cool. I'm sorry. Yeah, Potch, you don't count. So this is what you do. In order to ship a AppCache on there, it actually is a entity on an HTML tag, or an attribute rather. You just put the manifest thing on the HTML tag, and then you give it a URL that represents the location of your manifest. And then the problem is that that entity has to exist at load time. When the file is originally parsed, it has to be there. So you can't load it dynamically using JavaScript. And so it's kind of a problem if you don't want it to be there, because AppCache will completely take over from your Service Worker. So that add AppCache part gets a little bit tricky. What we ended up doing was using an iframe. So you can load up an iframe, display it to none, and then set the source to just a really small HTML file that all it does is load an AppCache effectively, and append that to your child, and then all of a sudden that AppCache will take over the entire domain, and you're able to do it dynamically. So you just have a really tiny HTML file that looks like this, that all it's doing is literally just loading that asset right there. And it works. And so what an AppCache looks like internally is just this. It's a text file, where a Service Worker is pure JavaScript. This is just like a literal list of URLs, effectively. It's every single file you want to have available offline. Up at the top, you say cache manifest, just because it has to say cache manifest for some reason. Again, it's a really stupid idea in spec. Then you just have a static list of all assets you want to have available offline. In this case, they are automatically generated in my build process. Because I'm an engineer, I really over-engineered my child's distraction toy, and so I created a build process. And then finally, we just have the network attribute, because again, AppCache is terrible, and if you don't include this, it will assume every domain, every URL that you don't have in your list is offline. It completely assumes the world doesn't exist if you don't include this attribute. It's terrible. But again, if you know the sharp edges, it can be okay. What's great though is that on that crappy Canadian visit where we went a second time, it took my site loading from about 20 seconds or so to about 190 milliseconds. It can make a site load offline really, really quickly, because instead of loading from the network, it's loading from disk. It's just reading the file, right? And so while AppCache is really, really terrible, it can be helpful. The point I'm trying to make is that don't immediately dismiss something just because it's a douchebag. Sometimes they can kind of be your douchey friend, at least for the time being. And now, if you saw my other talk, you might remember that I mentioned I've been a web developer for a while. And so I know that offline apps isn't really a new concept. This is something that's been around for a really long time. Does anybody here remember HTAs? Anybody else? Oh man, yeah. So HTAs were hypertext applications. Has anybody ever, did anyone here ever use Windows 98 or Windows 95? Cool. Do you remember the help menus, those really ugly things? Those were web apps, those were HTAs. Those are offline web applications. So what that was, hypertext applications, because we used to have to say hypertext, is a little tiny manifest file that gets put in, and you get custom headers, and you get do all kinds of stuff. Anyway, because I was bored, I made Hush Little Baby into an HTA too. So it detects if you don't have a service worker and if you don't have app cache support and you are an Internet Explorer, it loads up this thing. So you can click that link, and it'll download it, and it'll be a little file. You can double click it, and it can, I don't know, soothe my baby in IE6, I guess. Like, there's no real reason to do it. But it works, and it's really cool. You know, you got like custom menus and all the other things that you could do in that terrible offline application. And you should never do this, it's really dumb. But the whole point is that it's not just a radical new way to create websites, progressive web apps. I mean, it's a radical new way to update sites. Like, there's no reason why I couldn't have shipped that exact same code back in IE5 and have it just work now if I could have somehow known how service workers would work in the future. The exact same code would have worked for the last 20 years. You can still support this on really ancient old websites and just have a progressive enhancement to it. You know, excuse me. And now, a lot of times people get confused with the service worker naming because they think it's a really bizarre structure. Does anybody know where the service worker name comes from? Why it's called a service worker? Shout it out. No?
Web worker.
Web worker. Thank you, Pudge. You get a gold star. Has anybody here ever used a web worker? All right, cool. Is anybody here who here has heard of web workers but hasn't used it? Okay, cool. So a service worker is really just a web worker with extra powers. They've been around for a really long time. They got merged into, this is Safari, so WebKit Core, back in 2008, which is insane. Like, that's a really long time ago on the web. We're coming up on a decade of having web workers. Just to replace your mind, the company I worked for didn't look like this, or this, or this, but this, like, it was a really, really long time ago. Like, this is IE8, or IE9, sorry. Wasn't quite that long ago. When IE9 was shipping, we had web workers. When that was a new thing, and we were so happy that it was not as crappy as IE8, web workers was the new, it was a really long time ago is the point I'm trying to get around. So what are they? Anyway, so what the point of web workers is that the web is kind of single-threaded by default. If you've ever like had to create a scroll handler, you know how terrible the website can get really, really, really quickly. And the reason is because everything's kind of fighting for the same resources, right? The browser doesn't know that in your scroll handler are you going to completely invalidate all of your styles, which would require an entire calculation. So it forces all these things to happen, and it locks everything up, and everything's kind of fighting for resources constantly, right? And so if you're doing something that requires a lot of calculation, you get this really, really gross, janky website. And now a lot of times if you're a good web developer, you're not interacting with the DOM a whole lot, and you probably can avoid that jank if the browser would only let you. And so what web workers allow you to do is just that. You can offload these tasks that might be mathematically heavy, but not interacting with the DOM directly or the browser directly. And you can put them into a thread. You can have an offline task that can just kind of pass messages back and forth between the browser and a worker. And so as a result, super, super expensive functions can become really, really cheap. And again, what's awesome is they've been around for a long time. If it's green in IE, it's a good thing. And it's green back to, I believe, IE9, maybe IE10. It doesn't matter because those browsers are dead. Now, you can do a lot of really fun stuff with that. Like was mentioned in the intro, I'm the maintainer for Modernizer. I made this website a little while ago. And one thing that I really wanted to do was for it to work as a PWA. I wanted the Modernizer builder to work offline. In case you're unfamiliar, Modernizer in version 3, we switched to a full modular build. So it used to be a single file. Now it's literally 300 individual files that you check off. And the reason why we did that is because a whole lot of people would include the entire Modernizer script and all the options, which can be like a really, really large amount. We have a detect for video autoplay where it literally base64 encodes a video to detect whether or not it has changed position over time. It's huge. It's like 500K just for that one detect, but for some websites it's required. We don't want people requiring all that stuff. We want them to know, not only that, but we really want them to know whether or not a module is severely increasing the load. And so we added this option up in the upper left-hand corner that keeps track of the number of features that users have checked. So by default, this is just a little bit, and then as you check stuff off, it tells you, and it updates right there. But I wanted this to work offline, so I didn't want to rely on a server connection to calculate gzip size. And so what happens is we ended up, every single time we get all those options, then we send it over to a worker that goes through it, generates the entire Modernizer file, then it puts it into a gzip file. Then it gzips it using JavaScript inside of a worker, something that would normally be really, really heavy, and it becomes really, really cheap. It just passes back the result object, and it never it never interacts with the checking process, even though it's happening every single time one of those checkboxes is ticked off. It just works. Sorry. So yeah, I'm like, we implemented gzip in JavaScript, and we were able to have something that runs every single time you tick off a box, which could be hundreds of objects at once. And it works really, really silky smooth. Check it out. Not only that, like my talk I gave yesterday on my Sass project, where I re-implemented Sass in Java. I didn't re-implement, actually. I transpiled Sass over to JavaScript. That was all running inside of a web worker. Not only that, we had projects like Less, Slim, Pug, which is called Jade now, Auto Prefixer, Haml and Sass, all kinds of stuff. All of those are implemented inside that same project, that web worker pre-process project. All those things can be available completely to work inside of a web worker. You can transpile entire languages, have the entire runtime running inside of a web worker, and work incredibly quickly. What other? Oh, yeah, you can have, so this is Pokedex.org, which is a really cool project. One of my coworkers, Nolan Lawson, implemented as a really, really high-performant website. You can do a lot of really fun stuff with it. He did this really neat trick where he used Virtual DOM, which is sort of like a really lightweight React. It's a DOM diffing library. And he implemented it within a web worker. And so normally when you do that kind of the DOM comparison between your virtual DOM and your real DOM, it can take a lot of time. Instead of, if something takes a lot of time, it can block the UI thread, which means as you're scrolling, it gets janky and gross. And so what he ends up doing is grabbing the event from virtual DOM, which you could do from React as well, sending it in a push message over to your web worker, then it does the calculation in a thread that won't interact with anything, and sends back the result. So as a result, it gets really silky smooth animations. So this is a Galaxy Nexus, which is like I think a 7-year-old phone at this point, 6-year-old phone, and that's performing better than most websites I've ever written in my life. Like, it works really, really well, and it's a piece of crap Android phone at this point. I mean, it was good at the time, but it's not that time anymore. You can do a lot of really, really cool, fast animations just by leveraging web workers and technology that's existed for a really long time on the web at this point. It's nearly a decade old. You can check out that project more at the Pokedex website on GitHub. So yeah, there's a lot of parts of PWAs that kind of make it useful. I've been around for a while, but some parts are even newer, like the Web App Manifest. The Web App Manifest is a spec that's existed for a couple of years now. It's being implemented in all major browsers except for Safari. I don't think officially supports it, but what's cool is it's just a JSON file. If you've ever created like a Chrome extension or Firefox extension or an Android app, you're probably familiar with the idea of a manifest. It's just a big JSON body that represents metadata about your app. You know, stuff like the name, the language, the text direction, icons, if you want to have a custom start page, you know, a bunch of options like that. And then in addition, you can define some more interesting stuff that are more specific to PWA, stuff like related applications. So say you work at an agency that has a native application in addition to your progressive web app or your website, and they want your company wants you to use your native application for whatever reason. You can actually prefer that. So if a user installs it and they click on a link, it'll automatically open inside of your app. And then, yeah, you can toggle whether or not you actually want that to happen, whether or not you prefer related applications. And what's cool is, in order to support a manifest, all you have to do is include this link tag. It's just a single HTML tag. That's all it is, and it just goes inside of all of your existing code. And it works. It works really, really well. It's not only that, it's really, really simple, and it won't break any website. It's one of those things that I have on my Hush Little Baby thing that doesn't affect IE5, even though it still works and loads there. Just another tag that you load, that you get it. And yeah, so one thing that you might notice is that a lot of these elements are kind of redundant data. You know, like you're putting your same title, or putting similar colors or icons. That's a lot of data that we already have in a lot of our meta tags, and that's kind of, I don't know about you, but a lot of websites I work on end up kind of looking like tag soup up in the header because you have all these different Apple icons or different meta tags, and so a lot of that data is actually repeated. And because of that, and because I really want people to start building progressive web apps, I made a tool. It's on NPM. It's called Manifestation. And what that does is it goes out and scrapes your domain. You give it a URL, and it can go out and scrape all the different meta tags off of it, download all your icons, download your start icons, download your stuff, and generate a web manifest for you. And it's really, really in-depth. This is one for language, I believe. Yeah. And it's really kind of neat. It uses a Cheerio, which is like a server-side jQuery, and CLD, or compact language detection, which is actually a binary file that looks at text corpus. It's similar to basically what powers Google Translate, but in a small like C module. and it will actually download the URL that you give it. It will check for a language attribute tag, and if it has that, it'll use that as your language. If it can't find that, it will fall back to an XML language attribute, because some sites still have that for some unknown reason. If it doesn't have that, it'll actually fall back to DC language, Dublin Core. Any librarians? No? Okay. Hey, all right. Dublin Core was like a really, I don't know, it's a tagging thing that exists, and so we want to support it. So basically the whole point is that we want, if you have a language, which every website should, we want to be able to find it. And if we can't find it in markup, we actually fall back to CLD, or compact language detection, where we'll literally just ingest the entire corpus of the text on your page and figure out the most predominant language there. So it'll figure it out even if you're not declaring it, and then it'll output it. And that's one of the simpler ones. We actually have one of the more advanced ones, which is like icons, which I won't bore you with, but this is like the modules it loads just to be able to detect what icon is available. It almost fills up this whole page. And that loads everything from Apple icons to favicons to even like XML Microsoft tags, which no one uses, but some people do. Oh yeah, and even if you use like the XML file that loads those tile images inside of it, like just any if there's a way to define icons, this module will find it and it'll put it in there for you automatically. And it's something where web manifests is such a simple concept, and it's such a easy thing to get going. There's no excuse why you shouldn't be able to start using it today on existing projects. And so I made this website, Web Manifest, which is really just a web version of manifestation. And so what it is if you just go to this domain, it's really simple, it's a single page, you'll get this thing, you'll give it a URL, and it will spit out a file. And it'll just give you the entire text file. And it's your whole manifest. It's everything you have. All you have to do is download that, then put it in a link tag, and it works. You can do that right now. You can literally do that while I'm talking. I can give you a second if you want. And your websites will suddenly start to become progressive web apps, because that's one of the first things you can do to have it work. There's also a couple of cute little URLs off of that if you're more interested in Web Manifest, because it's a fun way to kind of get involved in standards. It's a fairly simple spec. So if you ever want to get involved with kind of pushing the web forward, hop on that spec link and you can check out what's going on. But I want to talk about, yeah, so the neat thing about it being available in a link tag like this is not only that it doesn't really affect, or it doesn't break old browsers, like you don't have to do feature detection or anything, it's just something you can add. Not only that, but it makes that data available and easily findable. In fact, there's a couple of companies that exist just to crawl the internet, almost like Google and Bing. And all they do is go out and figure out what the heck you're trying to do on your website, right? And so what's neat is if you start to add these sorts of things, these manifests to your page, it can be an indicator to Bing and to Google that this is actually PWA. And so you can start to indicate that you could be treated with special privileges, or you could be treated as special highlight. In fact, one of the things that my team is currently working on at Microsoft is to automatically inject PWAs into the Windows App Store. This is definitely something you'd be able to opt out of if you're not interested in it, but by default what's going to happen is that we'll be able to crawl the web whenever we find something that ranks like or smells like a progressive web app, and manifest is one of the key indicators. We'll actually be able to automatically generate what we call a UWP, a Universal Windows App, basically, and ingest it into the store automatically. So if one of your users ever goes out and looks for your web app on the store, they'll get a link directly to install it, even if you never had to make a Windows app. You know, you don't even have to do, I don't know about you, but whenever my mom looks for something I built, she goes to either her iPhone store or the Windows App Store to look for it, because she doesn't really understand that you can go to a website to install. So it's confusing for a lot of users. And so being able to ingest it into a store environment means that you get more people finding it. And you know, this is kind of, when we were first discussing this, it brought up a lot of emotions inside of me, just because it's sort of a niche specific browser thing, right? And we lived through the bad days of the internet where things were best viewed in certain browsers, and I don't want to go down that same way again. But at the same time, when you do stuff, you can build stuff with standards, and you can build stuff that works across platform and still have it kind of be specialized for specific places. Take, for example, Electron. These are web apps, like we all know. This is what it spun off of the Atom project from GitHub's code editor. Electron is just sort of a thin wrapper. It's a Chromium runtime that can run a website as a web app, and it makes it feel like a native application. But one of the problems that some users had at the very early days of Electron is those little close buttons. Electron had its own kind of unique way to open, close, and minimize things that were unique to Electron, that didn't work in the same way. They worked identically in OS X and Windows. And users aren't used to that. Like OS X has a very specific way of closing and opening things, and Windows has a very specific way of closing and opening things. Much in the same way, when you're building a progressive web app, if you really want it to feel like a native application, you have to think about ways in which you can hook into the native platforms in order to strengthen it. You definitely want to write code in a way that works across browser, but you can start to progressively enhance and add features that kind of work only on one browser. This is not anything new. This is not something that Microsoft is proposing to add to the web. This is for years now, browsers have been adding specific features just for their browser. An example is Safari push notifications. Safari was the first browser to support full push notifications, came out I think 6 years ago. And for a long time now, you've had the ability to register to be able to send people push notifications. So there's like e-commerce websites can send a notification to a user to let them know that if they want to be notified when a price drops, or CNN can push you push notifications when something terrible happens in America again. And this is something that didn't see a lot of uptick because I think a lot of developers were sort of concerned that they didn't really want to support something for just one browser, which in my opinion is a mistake. If you can support something that's just in one browser, even if it is proprietary to begin with, you can really influence the way that it moves, and you can influence the way that things come when it becomes a standard. And web push is a great example of something that eventually became a standard. It took a number of years, but now web push is supported in Firefox, it's supported in Chrome-based browsers, it's coming to Edge very soon, again, and it's something that you can basically have push notifications across all major browsers now. And it's something that you could have been doing for 5 years, and you could have had all this, institutional understandings of how to handle push notifications if you jumped in really early. A more recent example is like the Apple Payment API. You've been able to, from within a website, you can now actually directly tie into Apple Pay so that users can use their Apple Watch or your little, fingerprint on your phone to pay for something on your website. Does anybody here work in e-commerce or ever done something where people pay you on the internet? Okay, cool. Yeah, the fewer steps that you can have before people give you money, it's really good. Like you can just grease that funnel as much as possible. And so when you can hook into the payment information that users want to use, and users have already loaded all that data into, it becomes really, really good. Now, unfortunately, the Apple API was a proprietary implementation, but that was because of some issues with the way that Safari had architected it originally. In fact, we do already have a web payment API in Edge, and it's a really pretty straightforward one. The Safari one works similarly, a little bit different, but the Edge one and the one that ships in all other major browsers soon looks pretty easy. All you have to do is define a few, basically just arrays of JSON objects. At the beginning, we support, the method data, where we define the type of transaction. In this case, it's just a simple credit card, which means it's basically a form fill. The types of credit cards we support, and whether or not we support debit or credit cards, that sort of thing. And then we have a details object where we do stuff like, this is where you define all the different fields that will pop up in your wallet, like if something's taxed, if it's shipping information, that sort of thing. And the currency that it's in. And finally, just another simple object of whether or not you want to have multiple menus. In this case, we're requesting shipping information as well, so the little OS UI that pops up can make sure to include that. And then finally, all you have to do is a really simple feature detection, check to see if the payment request is available on the window. If it is, fire it off. And the great thing is, if it's not available, you just fall back. You just fall back to the same form-based API fill that you already have today. Right? This is just another progressive enhancement that will let you directly hook into the operating system. As of right now, the only stable browser that's shipping the standards thing is Edge, but it actually just started shipping in Canary in Chrome, I believe 2 weeks ago. So it'll be unstable by this holiday season, so if anybody in e-commerce wants to do stuff for Christmas, it's a good time to get on it. But to go back for a second and talk about sort of that store ingestion model, one of the really exciting things about it from my perspective is when you create a PWA like the example here, it can automatically show up both in the store and online, and it can really enable all these different ways for users to really think of an application, of your web application, like an app, like what they think other applications are if they don't really understand the underlying technologies. And one of the things that is the most exciting, specifically on the Windows platform about this, is that you actually have access to the full WinRT API, the Windows Runtime API. So back in Windows 7 era, we actually ported pretty much all of the available APIs in Windows into JavaScript. We've been doing this for years, but within the context of a PWA, you'll now have access to all of those things. you can actually access any of the individual WinRT APIs directly from JavaScript. Now, obviously this won't work on the web, but it will work in a PWA, because all of your PWAs, when they're installed on Windows, are wrapped up inside of what we call a UWP, or Universal Windows Platform Application. And therefore, because the user trusts it enough to install it, it can have all the access to all the APIs that they would have from any other app that they trust enough to install. So you can do a lot of fun stuff. You can have access to like Bluetooth through the Windows device's Bluetooth API. So this can directly connect to speakers or any Bluetooth device. You know, we have somebody doing research into CPR dummies right now, where they can directly connect remotely through Bluetooth over that to a device like a Windows tablet. We have not only that, if you're connecting to like headphones or something, you have access to media keys, so you can directly control like the play, pause, forward thing if you're doing like a jukeboxy sort of thing. Again, directly through the Windows APIs. We have OCR implementations, which currently the only way to do OCR, optical character recognition, so like text to, like automatically recognizing text, is by using an emscripted version of Tesseract, which is like a 30-year-old library that is really, really, really heavy. And so you can actually leverage the direct built-in parts of the operating system to build more and more advanced features onto your operating system. You can progressively enhance your web application with native APIs. I mean, you can even hook into Cortana, which is our virtual voice assistant thing. So you could have something like it be able to directly query your app by voice easily using the Windows API. And this can be the exact same code that you ship to every browser. It can be available everywhere. This is something that I expect to see available pretty much in all browsers. Be able to have a standardized version of a voice assistant. But for right now, you can start to play with it in the really early days behind these proprietary APIs before they become fully web standard. But there's a lot of things that have been around, like I said, for a long time that are available in other browsers, and other people just don't really use them. IndexedDB is a classic example. Again, this is something that's been around forever. I believe it originally ended in Firefox. Ben was at Firefox. And Mozilla, God, how long ago was that? 2010. So again, a really, really old feature that a lot of people. Has anybody here ever shipped IndexedDB code? All right. What do you do with IndexedDB?
We used to make a draft system for a commenting engine we had.
A drafting system, so like to type in it stores it.
Yeah, we used to save drafts, and we used IndexedDB in order to query the results.
Gotcha. So you used it as like an offline store to be able to keep everything in there. Yeah, and that's a really great example for what IndexedDB. So IndexedDB is basically like a low-level database that exists in a browser, and you can do all kinds of data querying against it. Problem is that most people want interfaces that look something like this. I assume most of us have probably checked out local storage before. It's really simple key storage. So you just set something called foo, and you get the value of bar, and then when you call what's the value of foo, you get bar. It's great. It's really easy. To implement this in IndexedDB, and one of the reasons why a lot of people probably haven't used it is it looks like this. It's really, really complex. This isn't a joke. This is literally what you have to do to have a solid cross-browser implementation of a really simple key value lookup. It's gross. And not only that, not only is it complex to use directly, because it was honestly sort of invented to be the base that things would be built on, there's a lot of different ways to store data in the browser. So a lot of people don't really know, what you can do. There's IndexedDB, there's local storage, like I said, there's a few more APIs and a few more APIs. There's a lot. There's a lot of ways that you can store. All these are ways to store text data on the browser. Some of them have been around for 25 years, some have been around for 2 years. It can be gross. The nice thing is that IndexedDB is becoming one of the kind of bedrock fundamental pieces that make the web useful, and make the web useful for really large data. There's a few libraries that exist to make this a lot more palatable. Dexy is one of my favorites. It gives you kind of a nice jQuery-like syntax. It's called Dexy.js. You can have large data stores and be able to do sort of, it's nice, it's pretty, and it actually makes sense. It's not that giant glob of JavaScript I just violated your eyes with. There's local forage, which gives you a literal local storage-like implementation directly on IndexedDB, so you can store really large data on it. PouchDB, Nolan, the guy that made the Pokedex API, is the maintainer for Pouch, and you can store an entire database. It's a couch database, CouchDB, offline and in your app. You can sync it between clients. It's really cool.
They're just wrappers for IndexedDB, is that right?
These are all wrappers around IndexedDB, absolutely. And PouchDB specifically actually falls back to Web SQL and local storage, depending on a browser environment or stability of that IndexedDB. And one of the things that a lot of people don't realize about IndexedDB that's true there but not other places is you can actually store gigabytes of data in IndexedDB, and that is gigabytes with a G. You can store a ton of data. And I know in Edge, we're the worst. You can store, I think, like 10 gigabytes of storage is the max you can possibly do. In Firefox, Chrome, and I believe Safari as well, you can store up to 50% of available hard drive space it's a crazy amount of space. So you can store entire films, entire audio files. If you want to explore with this a bunch, there's a thing called the storage abuser. It's available online. Where you can, that's its name. You can literally just say, like, I want to see how much local storage I can store, how much IndexedDB I can check out. The domain's right here. It's really, really cool. And you know, you can really start to rethink how much stuff you can have available offline. Obviously, this shouldn't be mission critical stuff because you shouldn't be expecting people to have to download, you know, a 400 megabyte video in order to use your application. But if you're a media player, or if you have something that you want to have available, you can lazy load that in the background, store it in a cache, and have it available. So they only ever have to download it one time. You know, that stuff won't get evicted easily in the future. So yeah, there's a whole bunch of cool stuff to use on IndexedDB, IndexedDB. There's a whole bunch of cool stuff to use on the web, and a lot of this stuff has been around for a long time. And the point that I'm trying to make with all this nonsense is that you shouldn't have to wait for re-architecture. You shouldn't have to, you know, stop. You should be starting to today. You should start making cool stuff today. And not only that, you should use the brand new stuff today. There's new features coming out constantly in Firefox, in Chrome, in Canary builds, in, you know, all the nightly browsers, in Edge, of course. You should start using all those new features. Follow us on Twitter, follow us on all of our blogs, and start using all those crazy new things, because you can really, really make compelling, crazy user experiences. You can make them today. You know, just make awesome stuff, and if you have any questions about how to do it, feel free to reach out. Thanks.
You have time for
Yeah. Does anybody have a question? Or
2 questions.
something you want to complain about IE or anything? No. Well, that's fine. My answer is it's dead anyway, no matter what the question
Well,
is.
honestly, I have a question.
Please.
So I'm now wearing the attendee hat, right?
Mhm.
So I was thinking, I just looked it up because I actually didn't know, but I heard somewhere that the Chromium project has 22 million lines of code
Mhm.
by itself.
Yeah.
So every time you use Electron, that basically downloads and the Chromium
Yeah,
and
absolutely.
that makes it run. And then I was thinking, every time I run Slack and Atom and Chrome, the computer starts like taking off if it could.
Yeah, I don't know. It's extremely hot. You can take an egg on it. Chrome, the people at Chrome are a wonderful team, and they make wonderful code, but some of it's not terribly efficient, unfortunately. And that's a great example of it. If you load up multiple Electron apps, you'll notice it really quickly. And unfortunately, one of the reasons that kind of a lot of people got drawn to Electron in the early days is because it's a stable environment to build web apps. Like, you actually know absolutely everything about it. The problem is that we found through researching a lot of Electron apps in the wild that a lot of people stop updating the versions of Chromium, which means that if there's a CVE that's reported, like security issues or any bugs that have been patched or any features that come out, their users aren't getting them. And so if you do have an Electron app, I urge you to be making sure to update a lot of that stuff as much as possible. And then also there's a project called Electrino, I believe, which is using, rather than using the Chromium runtime, it'll actually use the underlying operating system's runtime. So it'll use like Edge HTML or the WebKit on Safari, or it'll use you know, the Chromium views on Android. It's a really cool project that can prevent a lot of that problem.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, absolutely. Any other questions? Feel free to reach out. I'd be happy to answer any complaints or happiness. Thank you.